Hello and welcome to The Swinging Christies, the podcast about Agatha Christie in the swinging 60s. We are Christie Time. I'm Dr Mark Aldridge. I'm an associate professor and I've written a lot about Agatha Christie, including my brand new book, Agatha Christie's Marple, Expert on Wickedness.
Yes, and I'm Gray Robert Brown. I'm a writer, I'm a Christie fan, and I'm a Muriel Spark fan. As are you.
Yes, there's room in our lives for more than one author.
Woman, I thought you were going to say.
Well, that too. But especially female authors.
How are you?
Oh, good. Yes. We're having an exciting weekend.
We are. There's a horrible storm raging outside, so we've just holed ourselves up and recorded what feels like 18 episodes.
Yes, and definitely not looking at the train timetables that may or may not get you home.
Oh, have you?
Yeah.
Oh, no, really?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's for a discussion off mic.
And I do start to charge rent after the second night. So, just to let you know.
Oh, dear. So this episode, we're doing something a little bit different, which is exciting. So Muriel Spark, for those who don't know, dear listeners, is a sort of near contemporary of Agatha Christie's, a novelist principally. And we're presenting in this episode a little talk that I gave a couple of years ago now, specifically about the confluence, the points of convergence between Muriel Spark and Agatha Christie. So there'll be plenty within this for Christie fans to enjoy, of interest to us, of course, in this project. So Spark starts publishing her novels just before the period that we're looking at, actually, and like Christie, writes consistently through the 1960s, very industriously. These are very productive people. The Spark books that I talk about in my talk are Memento Mori from 1959, so same year as Cat Among the Pigeons. Mm-hmm. The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie from 1961, that's the same year as The Pale Horse, although it's set in the 30s, it's set more around, shall we say, ABC Murders time. The Driver's Seat from 1970, so a contemporary of Passenger to Frankfurt, and Not to Disturb the year after, so pretty much a contemporary of Harlequin Tea Set. I gave the talk originally at the Christie conference, didn't I? But then the version that you'll hear today is the version that I gave for Romancing the Gothic. Dr Sam Hirst, who runs that, who we met at the Christie conference. It's a brilliant platform. It's a place for like-minded readers to kind of come together and talk about the books and more that interest them. There are a few talks, including by listener Jordan Welsh, hello Jordan, in their back catalogue about Christie and Christie adjacent topics. So it's definitely worth checking them out if you're interested. But yes, this is the talk I gave. It's funny, we both listened to it ahead of recording this, obviously, or listened again, I should say. And I thought the little plug that I gave for the Swinging Christies was really sweet. Yes. Because, of course, at that time we we'd recorded the intro.
Yes, I think.
And we knew it was coming, yes. But yeah, we hadn't really, it was all very new. We had the sort of social media accounts, but it wasn't. So am I right in saying I introduced you to Muriel Spark in the first place? That might have been one of our first conversations.
It was one of our first conversations, yes, when we met at the conference. And so you were telling me all about Muriel Spark and, we got on very well. And then we obviously had similar tastes. And then a few weeks later, I went to America on holiday and I had a copy of The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie to read. Can I say I strongly recommend Muriel Spark books for long haul flights? Like they're just the right length. Because you've got time enough to do the other stuff of sort of like, wait for the food to come round and watch whatever's on your TV. But they're really good for like 3 or 4 hours worth of reading in the middle of a long haul flight. Yeah. So strong recommend. And just while I was on the runway about to take off, I sent you a picture of, and you replied, I remember this really clearly, saying, "Oh my God, that's my favourite book." And I was like, yes, that's the whole point.
It is. I genuinely think it is the best book ever written. And that's not to say I think a lot of Agatha Christie's are very high up there in my esteem, but I do think The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie is the best book ever written. And yeah, as we're arguing this episode, I think there's loads in there that a Christie fan will enjoy, isn't there?
Yes.
So yes, here's the talk, and then we'll have a little chat afterwards.
Fab. Hi. First of all, big thanks to Dr. Sam Hirst, of course, for allowing me to come along and talk to you all, and also just for creating this space where we can all talk about the books and other things that we love. We're really lucky to have it. Actually, I'm really enjoying being a part of it. And thank you to you all for coming. And I'll do my best to make sure this is a worthwhile use of your time. So, at the start of Agatha Christie's 450 from Paddington, a moving train draws parallel with another. A Scottish woman looks out of her window and sees a murder in the train carriage opposite. Now, Muriel Spark is one of the most successful Scottish literary talents of all time. Agatha Christie is the most popular crime novelist of all time, or, to put it another way, she had a talent for murder. The trains of their lives and works, can you see what I'm doing here, run more or less parallel with a few divergent stopping points, but with both contributing in meaningful and distinct ways to the Western cultural landscape of the 20th and the 21st centuries. So whilst Christie was mostly, but not entirely, operating within the crime thriller school, Spark's novels play with the genre in a more mercurial way. I will argue that both writers have been underestimated as lightweight by a literary culture that is laced with misogyny, as if it's kind of cyanide in the soup. Both writers' works run the gamut all the way from camp to cruel, and in doing so challenged reductive perceptions of domesticity and femininity. By comparing and contrasting their lives and their works, we can appreciate both writers' works more fully and hopefully convert more of you to being Spark fans. So it's true to say that biographical criticism can only take us so far, but these two authors' lives offer much to compare. Spark resisted others' attempts to narrativize her life, so I can only assume she'd be absolutely furious about this. Christie, too, actually rejected several attempts to write her life story before eventually relenting and writing it herself. But she said, "If anybody writes about my life in the future, I'd rather they got their facts right." A quote which, if I didn't know any better, I would have said that was Spark talking. So Agatha Christie was born in 1890 in Devon. Spark was born in 1918, over 400 miles north of her in Edinburgh. Christie passed away in 76 and Spark exactly 30 years later in 2006. For both authors, there is staggeringly around half a century between the composition of their first and last novels, though in the productivity stakes, Christie tears strips off literally every other writer, publishing at least one book a year in that time, whereas Spark averaged closer to one every 2 years, which is, lazy, frankly. Like the iconic protagonist of Spark's greatest novel, The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie, let us ask, when were their respective primes? So arguably Christie's was in the 30s, in which she published hits such as Murder on the Orient Express and Death on the Nile. She put the difficulties of her first marriage breakdown behind her. This was the decade in which she met and married her second husband and introduced Miss Marple in novel form to the world. Spark's prime was later in the 1960s, the decade in which she introduced Miss Brodie to the world, her spinster, quoting Blair, and was shortlisted for the Booker Prize for the first time, if not the last. But let's not forget that Christie was still writing up to and beyond the 60s herself. And in fact, just a very brief side note, you can hear me and my friend Dr. Mark Aldridge talking about Christie in the 1960s and how neglected that is and how important it is to see her as a meaningful contributor to the 60s culture in our forthcoming podcast, The Swinging Christies. And you can follow us on social media at Christie_time. Quote, "You must be on the alert to recognize your prime at whatever time of your life it may occur," says Jean Brodie. And I like to think that Spark, her creator, was one to heed this advice. There is a familial basis for this affinity between Christie and Spark too. So Spark had a complex relationship with her son Robin, who she temporarily left in the care of a convent in what is now Zimbabwe during the Second World War, while he was sort of 5 or 6. Their discordant relationship culminated in a very public tabloid spat in the 90s over Robin's insistence that Muriel should self-identify as Jewish despite her conversion to Catholicism. Says Martin Stallard, a Spark biographer, "Some members of the press could never forgive her for being a free woman. They concentrated on her relationship with her son." It's worth noting that there are two very good reasons as to why Muriel left Robin temporarily, one being the danger of the voyage in wartime, and the other being the complete embargo on transporting children at the time, quoting Stannard again there. So similarly, many reported a sometimes difficult dynamic between Christie and her daughter Rosalind. It's telling that many narratives of Christie's disappearance and her world travels make specific reference to the act of this mother leaving her child behind. Similarly, many profiles of Robin Spark led with his, quote, abandonment for many years after the fact. I'm paraphrasing Lucy Worsley now, the most recent biographer of Christie. Would all this make Agatha that endlessly satisfying target, the bad mother? Of course not, for there is no such thing. But she never felt she had to throw herself into mothering. Some of her most thoughtfully depicted relationships in her books are those between mothers and daughters. I would posit that these publicised perceived failings from maternal figures may in part explain why our literary culture has struggled to fully embrace both writers. In Christie's case, this often manifests as gatekeeping between genre, her work, and literary. Spark, on the other hand, is broadly accepted by the literary intelligentsia, but holds minimal cultural currency beyond that. Logically, it tracks that it is easier to dismiss the work if the writer is deemed to be an unworthy person. Alan Taylor, a friend of Spark's, wrote, "The popular image of her was someone who was something of a misanthrope." He elaborated on the Penguin Classics podcast, saying, "People didn't seem to catch her character. They wrote about the cruelty she showed to her characters, but they don't understand what people from Edinburgh are like." Apologies to any Scots listening. Meanwhile, Christie is often regarded as a, quote, jolly and bucolic lady, as Alison Light so brilliantly put it. The truth, as we shall see in both cases, is far more complex. As with any 20th century biography, the world wars inevitably have interjected. So Spark, quote, was born on the first day of the second month of the last year of the First World War. By this time, Christie worked in a dispensary and, quote, "It was while I was working there that I first conceived the idea of writing a detective story." Indeed, her first novel and many others make good use of her knowledge of poisons. Quote, "That idea of yours about the bromides was a stroke of genius," if Christie does say so herself in The Mysterious Affair at Styles. Christie is sometimes accused of writing in a Never Never Land, but the First World War is foundational to her entire canon as the instigator that brings Hercule Poirot and his sidekick Captain Hastings together. Christie then returned to the dispensary in the Second World War. Meanwhile, Spark joined the British intelligence in 1944, working on, quote, black propaganda, which is misinformation transmitted over enemy lines to undermine their ideology. As with Christie, the themes of this war work became integral to Spark's writing. She once charmingly described her collected novels as a pack of lies. Indeed, one can trace many of Spark's preoccupations back to this theme, including her metatextual, metaphysical manipulations of narrative perspective, her fight with Robin, and her near allergic reaction to biographies. Fascinatingly, Christie mentions that she was also, quote, asked if she would like to do propaganda work in her autobiography by none other than Graham Greene, the writer who would later become Spark's pen pal. Christie declined this offer, but it's further evidence of how Spark and Christie are kind of unknowingly occupying the same space at the same time. Once you start looking, these comparisons are almost too numerous to list, so I'll rattle through a couple now. But Spark's conversion to Catholicism looms almost as large in her canon as Christie's Catholic Hercule Poirot does in hers. Spark's first full-length novel, The Comforters, was birthed from an adult and spiritual point in Spark's life, which kind of heralded her conversion. By extension, we can view her whole body of work as arising from this epiphany. Both the Poirot canon and the Spark oeuvre include running themes of repentance, forgiveness, and justice. Poirot is often depicted as a father confessor type character, while Spark perpetually constructs these narratives with an ultimate higher power standing in judgment. Usually, let's be honest, it's herself. And perhaps the meticulous Poirot effectively followed Spark's advice. Quote, if you're going to do a thing, she's reported to have said, you should do it thoroughly. If you're going to be a Christian, you may as well be a Catholic. Both writers were occasionally inspired by current affairs, although neither is known for being a satirist or even comfortably openly political, which I think is reductive. As far back as at least her third novel, Murder on the Links, Christie was using real-life crimes to model her plots. Most notably from Spark, we have a book called Aiding and Abetting, a late novel, which is fantastic. It's her response to the disappearance of Lord Lucan. And the current Canongate edition calls that her, quote, mordant and witty satirical take on the true crime genre. And by the way, David Goldie makes the sly but accurate point that it's ironic that Spark is sensitive about people writing her life while displaying in this novel an apparent absence of concern for the feelings of Lady Lucan, which I believe is what we call literary shade. I mean, most importantly, the most important comparison between these two writers that I'm going to make today is that both writers' adaptations star the incomparable Maggie Smith, who won an Academy Award for her portrayal of Miss Jean Brodie and later appeared in the BBC adaptation of Memento Mori, as well as a much celebrated turn in the 1978 Death on the Nile. I made the point that Christie and Spark share a sense of camp, and I'd be doing a disservice, I think, to the concept of camp if I didn't mention Dame Maggie Smith. Ultimately, what links these two authors most comprehensively is not Maggie Smith, spoiler, it's the fact that they read each other. Thanks to John Curran, we know that Spark novels The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie and The Driver's Seat are listed in Christie in her notebooks. Specifically, Curran tells us that mention of The Driver's Seat comes alongside a short list of books all published in 1970, and that it interrupts the notes for Nemesis. The reference to Brodie, meanwhile, has 2 pluses marked beside it and is struck through. It's unclear what exactly this means. It could be read, could be loved. And thanks to Dr. Jamie Berntal, we know that Christie even requested complimentary copies of Spark's books. I enjoy Muriel Spark very much, Christie had told the London Sunday Times. She's always so original, she said. And we know from Janet Morgan that Christie saw the play version of The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie in London in 1966. Characteristically, when Christie mentions Spark, she speaks with sincerity. When Spark refers to Christie, it's in the form of kind of witty asides. So, for example, there's a lot of people who think they can take my books and analyze me from them. On that principle, Agatha Christie would be a serial killer. When Spark was burgled, she pondered, we have various theories worthy of Agatha Christie, but so far no results. Note the admiration implicit in the word worthy there. But one of the reasons why both writers are sometimes underestimated, I would argue, is their prose style. Spark's economy of artistic means has undoubtedly prejudiced critics who automatically equate length with depth, writes Alan Bold. And similar has been said about Christie by peers such as Edmund Wilson and P.D. James. Spark taking a course in précis writing is wittily put by A.L. Kennedy as like a hawk taking flying lessons. Even wittier is Spark herself describing the protracted length of a James Joyce novel, calling it rude. She's right. In her autobiography, Christie declares, I think myself that the right length for a detective story is 50,000 words. The totemic Brodie by Muriel Spark runs at just 40,000. Christie actually situates her prose in contrast to authors like Spark. Quote, when you begin to write, you are usually in the throes of admiration for some writer, and whether you will or no, you cannot help but copy their style. If I could write like Elizabeth Bowen, Muriel Spark, or Graham Greene, I should jump to high heaven with delight, but I know that I can't. I have learned that I am me. We should take this with a pinch of salt because here is Christie's trademark self-deprecation. As in many ways, Spark's writing is more like hers than she claims, sharing a preference for upfront characterization and for declarative sentences that evoke no-nonsense plain speaking. Thank you very much. Now, onto the case study. In the bookshelves, Spark is shelved away from Christie in the fiction section, but I would argue that 3 of Spark's novels in particular have grounds to be reshelved in crime, and they are Memento Mori, The Driver's Seat, and not to disturb. Take a self-enclosed community of writers, schoolgirls, nuns, rich people, etc. Toss in a bombshell like murder, suicide, betrayal that will ricochet dangerously across this little world. That's Spark's formula, according to Michiko Kakutani's review of Aiding and Abetting, quoted in James Bailey, but it could also be read as a formula for crime novels generally and for Christie novels specifically. It's a why done it, Lise, the main character of The Driver's Seat, announces. She's talking about the garishly covered book that she is reading at the time, but she could just as well be talking about the book in which she stars. In fact, Bailey points out that Lise is garishly covered too, as the novel opens with a scene of Lise in search of a gaudy outfit that is crucially not stain resistant. The Driver's Seat, for those of you who haven't read it, I would recommend, although trigger warning, it's dark. The Driver's Seat is the story of a woman who is looking for the right man to murder her. It has been observed that Lise's arc is a parody of an Austenite romance novel, a parody of of looking for a man to marry her. But I would argue that more than that, The Driver's Seat is a response to whodunit. It's a why done it, Lise tells us herself. John Lanchester, in his foreword for The Driver's Seat, comments that in other works, the near jaunty tone could be at odds with its jet black content. In Spark World, they go together like murderer and victim. Murderer and victim are, of course, the two poles of Christie's fictional sphere. Then the novel published afterwards serves to immediately perpetuate Spark's thesis of kind of upturning the whodunit, and that's Not to Disturb, which is set across a single stormy night in a manor house in which a group of servants led by the enigmatic Lister enact their plan to murder their masters. And then there's Memento Mori, Spark's earlier treatise on the genre, which is about a circle of elderly London residents who are plagued by an anonymous caller who rings up to say to them simply, "Remember, you must die," which is, of course, a translation of the Latin title. A novel of mostly elderly cast trying and failing to get a grip on what exactly the mystery is that surrounds them could well summarize Christie's By the Pricking of My Thumbs, Elephants Can Remember, or Postern of Fate. So far, so Christie. This is until, handbrake turn, the solution to Memento Mori is proposed. Considering the evidence, I think the caller is death itself. We as readers are invited both to consider this the logical answer to the mystery, but also to boggle at it. Christie would never. Of course, all of Christie and all murder mysteries by their nature must involve death as at least a subtext. But here Spark goes one better. Death is the text. At one point, a character in the novel says, quote, "This graveyard is a kind of evidence that other people exist." Memento Mori is one of these books for which Spark is labelled cruel, but this to me makes it among her most humane. Whereas Memento Mori begins as a classic mystery before taking this sudden turn, The Driver's Seat and Not to Disturb scream their deviance from the first line. Spark allows us whodunit-hungry readers morsels, such as the Ziploc bag that Lise, the main character in The Driver's Seat, carries, is a literal evidence bag of pre-curated clues, including it has within it the murder weapon to which she wants to succumb. In Not to Disturb, instead of the police taking statements, we see the servants preparing their statements as exclusives that they're going to sell to the press, exposing their motivation up front. They even have grand plans for serialization and a film adaptation. Everything that usually appears spontaneous has been meticulously thought through, down to how much sleep they're going to get and therefore how alert they will be when the police arrive, as if the narrative is kind of seeing the crime tropes before they even have chance to manifest and play out. In Memento Mori, these genre components are mostly rattled through in the denouement, murder and motives. You can feel Spark's refusal to fit her story neatly into this genre box and tie all the loose ends up, down to the fact that one character leaves behind a bewildering array of 22 contradictory wills. Complete side note, but Spark would go on to write exactly 22 novels. Coincidence? I'll leave you to ponder. "You're coming with me," Lise says to a potential murderer. In the driver's seat, Lisa's defiant perversion of this normal victim narrative is so hyperbolic as to be amusing and appalling. As per Bailey, Lise has come to make herself strange and inscrutable, transforming her legible life into a mystery without an apparent solution, end quote. It's precisely what a Christie culprit does, marring and muddying their tracks, with Spark here transferring this action from culprit to victim, and in doing so challenging that binary. The driver's seat actually opens with what the All About Agatha Christie podcast would categorize as a costuming clue. The reader is led to believe in no uncertain terms that Lise has chosen a stainable and garish outfit for her trip, both so that she, quote, lays a trail in terms of eyewitnesses remembering her, and in an attempt to control the aesthetics of her soon-to-be lifeless body. This has many precedents in Christie, perhaps most notably in the short story The Plymouth Express from 1923. In this story, the way Flossie Carrington was dressed, quote, in a white fox fur toque with a white spotted veil and a blue frieze coat and skirt, the shade of blue they call electric, is deliberately standout. I'll give you a second just to picture that stunning outfit. Rather striking, says Poirot, slightly barbed. Poirot's hunch turns out to be completely correct. Quote, "It was the maid's insistence on those clothes that her mistress was wearing that first struck me. Why was she so anxious that our attention should be directed to them? Now, if, after Bristol, anyone saw a lady in a bright blue coat and skirt and a fur toque, he will be quite ready to swear he had seen Mrs. Carrington." Like the driver's seat, but unlike Christie's Not to Disturb is written mostly in the present tense. But crucially, Lister encourages us not to split hairs between the past, present, and future tenses. For him, it's immaterial, because though temporally the Baron is yet to die, for him, the Baron is already dead. Spark and Lister have decided to kill the Baron, so it may as well have already happened. "They haunt the house," says Lister of the Baron and their other victims, "like insubstantial bodies." This beautiful Gothic image of victim as apparition helps convert the text into a liminal space in which time is arbitrary. Or is it being obfuscated? Another of Christie's favourite narrative tricks from the likes of The Murder of Roger Ackroyd. With this time trickery, Not to Disturb is doing precisely what Christie is doing in novels like Towards Zero, specifically refocusing and recalibrating the time frame through which we view the crime, and posing the question, what if we started earlier? The crime may as standard happen in chapters 1 or 2, but the plans have been laid long before. All in all, if Christie was an admirer of Spark's style, then Spark, I would argue, is influenced by Christie's plots. A Spark novel is often a Christie novel, kind of half remembered and remixed, which, given how many of Christie's later works feel like they are echoing to us through a fog of recollection, feels doubly apt. Now, I'm deliberately not issuing a spoiler warning here. This is the opposite of a spoiler warning. No spoiler warning from me. Chapter 3 of The Driver's Seat plainly and horrifically opens thus. She will be found dead tomorrow morning from multiple stab wounds. It's one of Spark's favourite devices to spoil her own stories. It's in Prime too. We are told that Miss Brodie will be betrayed by one of her favourite pupils. We are also told that Joyce Emily had run away to Spain and been killed in an accident, and about Mary McGregor's horrific death by fire in almost the same breath as we're introduced to her. Similarly, the deaths in Not to Disturb, says Bold, are preordained, so there is no element of suspense. One might think that the key component of a mystery novel is to keep the mystery, or that any story must gradually release information to create suspense and keep the action propulsive. If this is the metric, then Spark's novels uniformly fail, but they do so deliberately. I want to be clear that this device that Spark uses is categorically not foreshadowing, for which most authors, including Christie, is their bread and butter. Take this example of foreshadowing from Christie's Cat Among the Pigeons. "I think," Julia said, "that we shall probably have a second murder soon." There is then a second murder, by the way. But this is far too non-committal for Spark's bold tastes. She doesn't want musings, she wants facts. Spark herself elaborated on the method to her madness on a Sunday feature. She said, quote, "It struck me that suspense is not necessarily keeping people hanging on to the last page to know what happened. People are even more interested if they know that X is going to die before the last page, but they still want to read on to know how. And if you do more or less know the end of the story, it still keeps people riveted even more." It may surprise you to say that this is a trick that Christie invokes too. It's a literary device, but it's essentially her classic crime fiction double bluff. Books like Lord Edgware Dies, Towards Zero, plays like Witness for the Prosecution, they all go to great lengths to frame the most obvious suspect early on, making the suspense of the story essentially whodunit, before Christie, with what we could call Sparkian mercurial spirit, comes forth at the end and goes, "No, that wasn't the full story," or "Yes, it was them after all, but there's a catch." "This is too easy," Poirot exclaims doubtfully in Lord Edgware Dies. In The ABC Murders, an excellent Christie novel, the way Alexander Bonaparte Cust, who we are led to believe is the murderer, crowbars into the narrative and buckles the story early with his confession, reminds one of James Bailey's quote about the driver's seat being the, quote, "efforts of a fictional character to overthrow her author and thus assume an unwarranted level of authorial power." It's this exact manipulation of readers like us who are genre savvy that Spark loves. Alan Perrow said of Memento Mori, "Disciplined by the tropes that govern the mystery novel, we read paranoically, hectically searching for conspiracy and confirmation at every turn." So although as I have shown, Spark borrows extensively from the murder mystery, it's significant that murder is seldom the central crime of a Spark novel. It's as if death would be too cut and dry, as she opts instead for similar symbols of transgression like blackmail and more abstract betrayals. The crime genre simply has too many rules for Spark, this queen of contrary and experimentation. But that's not to say that the queen of crime, Agatha Christie, who codified most of those rules to begin with, wasn't contrary and experimental too. Bailey says, Spark's fiction occupies a vexed position in relation to the existing critical discourse on experimental writing, citing her conspicuous absence from the Routledge Companion to Experimental Literature. If that book can't see its way to citing Spark, I highly doubt it gets around to citing Christie. I can't even begin to list the amount of 20th century literature accounts that neglect to cite Christie. So, moving on to our second case study. Whilst Cat Among the Pigeons is putting the cat among the pigeons with its foreshadowings, Spark refuses to let her cats out of the bag. Now we turn to the fascinating cross-pollination between Christie's school set mystery, Cat Among the Pigeons, and the prime of Miss Jean Brodie. Cat Among was published in 1959 and is a Poirot murder mystery. It's set in the fictional Meadowbank School for Girls, and it involves a jewel heist, a mysterious tennis racket, and the murder of a games mistress. It's fab. The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie is categorically the best novel ever written, and I will fight anyone that says otherwise. And it was published in 1961, and it's a novel set in the 1930s in the fictional Marcia Blame School for Girls, based partly on Spark's own school days. It is centered on the titular inspirational teacher who takes a group of her favorite pupils under her wing, but as they mature and they grow, they realize what their childhood hero really stands for. Obviously, neither of these writers can claim to have invented the school novel, but the thing is, neither of these novels are straightforward school set novels. In fact, both writers have a lot of fun placing incongruities within the school setting, a thriller plot muscling its way into Meadowbank, and the incongruity of a fascist in a Scottish girls' school. Secret agents, robbery, violence, murder, all preposterous, but that side of life exists, Adam tells us in Cat Among. Twists such as Christie including a gardener who is secretly a secret agent, and those twists are certainly not beyond the pale for Spark. And the wider context of the revolution that we see in Cat Among the Pigeons contrasts with the Spanish Civil War backdrop of Prime of Miss Jean Brodie. Both novels spend some time foregrounding the charming naivety of the students, discussing the adult world that seems to swirl above their heads, only half of which they understand as they're kind of sexualized beyond their years. Both Miss Brodie and Miss Bulstrode are placed beyond the narrative. Interestingly, Bulstrode is even explicitly considered above suspicion in the whodunit plot, which is a rare accolade in a Christie novel. That's a point made by the All About Agatha podcast again. Thanks to the headmistress, the great Miss Bulstrode, Meadowbank is described as unconventional but successful. She says, the school, quote, is a creation, if I may say it, of one woman, myself. And what then follows is exactly the sort of rousing and very vain speech that Miss Brodie makes. Bulstrode is, quote, full of cosmopolitan aplomb, whilst Brodie is memorably called an Edinburgh festival all of her own. The key difference, though, is that Meadowbank is run by the Maverick, whereas at Marcia Blaine, the Maverick Brodie very much stands on the outer edge. Miss Bulstrode was someone, Christie writes with a capital S to the someone, sounding uncannily similar to the epithets we continually hear in Prime. For example, Rose Stanley was famous for sex. Both texts then have these powerful female characters at the heart of their stories, and both writers are, of course, famous for their, quote, spinsters I mentioned earlier, Miss Marple and Miss Brodie, who both, to some extent, have been mixed up with the popular image of their creators, again, reductively, I think. But if you take away anything, take away this. Two things are undeniable. We know Spark read Christie, and Prime and Cat bear many striking similarities just 2 years apart. I think it's clear that this girls' school set mystery packed with intrigue must have been in the back of Spark's mind when she came to write her Prime. To conclude then, by contrasting Christie to a luminary of the literary world, albeit one that's sometimes neglected, we can better appreciate Christie's sophistication and skill, and the more insidious ways in which she too challenges the status quo. By positioning Spark within genre traditions, the shackles of which she's trying to cast off, we have thrown into clearer focus her radicalism and depth. We can resultantly view her much less as a lone ranger or a maverick, like Brodie, and instead more deserving of broader attention. I hope this study can act as a foundation on which to build more work that uses connections between these two authors to elevate and illuminate new aspects of their writing. While Christie has stayed remarkably consistently at the forefront of the cultural and adaptational landscape since she first rose to fame, Spark's trajectory, as we've said, is, in my opinion, wholly sadder and more unjust. She gained a certain level of notoriety from Brodie, but this light has undeniably dimmed since. Efforts were made in 2018, the Spark Centenary, to put her back on the map, pun thoroughly intended. One of the centerpieces of the celebrations of the Spark Centenary was a new play adaptation of the Prime Mystery and Brodie. Remember, Christie saw the 66 version, and this one was at the Donmar in Seven Dials. While 2 streets away, the face of Agatha Christie, set in bronze, looked on, I like to think, admiringly. Christie and Spark, spiritually less than half a mile away, artistically divergent, but also in harmony. Thank you.
Okay, so I've talked for long enough. I'm interested to hear your thoughts about the points raised, Dr. Mark Aldridge.
Well, would you expect anything else from me other than me making notes as I went through it? So let me go through my notes and see how we think. My first thing I've written down is parallels with AC. Just them? Question mark. In other words, is this, do you think, a particular Muriel Spark, Agatha Christie thing? Or did you get a sense that other writers are sort of not stepping on each other's toes, but like that there's stuff that's happening in the way they're telling stories?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think for me, I love this comparative stuff because I think I said in the talk, it brings out new angles, new ways of thinking about all sorts of writers, all sorts of works. Even if ultimately the comparison comes down to they're very divergent, you still learn something. I think it's still quite illuminating. So I don't for a second think that it's just Muriel Spark and Agatha Christie that share this affinity. I think that the evidence for it not just being a thought experiment on my part, a flight of fancy, shall we say, and it actually being something that there might be legitimate weight in, is the fact that we know, as I said, we know they read each other. But yeah, I think you could mount this kind of conversation or comparison about Agatha Christie and Shirley Jackson, about Agatha Christie and Iris Murdoch, about Agatha Christie and Sylvia Plath, like Elizabeth Taylor, who wrote Mrs. Palfrey at the Claremont, which is very Bertram's Hotel, by the way. Those kind of mid-20th century writers that sadly are quite neglected by, or I think unfairly neglected and sometimes maligned by modern literary commentary, all share a lot of DNA, in particular, partly, I guess, because of that status, because of that neglect, or the underestimating that goes on. Part of that, of course, is they exist in the same milieu. None of us can sever ourselves from our historical, social, popular culture context, and there's always going to be shared DNA when the reference points that are consuming you are the same. But yeah, it's funny you should say that, because we were going to say, if this sort of conversation is the sort of thing that our listeners enjoy hearing, then please do let us know. Like, we read, as you know, listener, we read widely and continue to read widely for this project. If you go to our website, there's on the tab resources, there's a whole list of all sorts of works that we've consulted, including contemporary novels, plays, right? So we would love to do more of this kind of comparative work if that's something that people would be interested in. But yeah, what do you think? Are there other writers that you've always thought share a lot of DNA with Christie besides Spark?
Well, I don't know in particular, but I think the fact that she just read so consistently through her whole life. So there is that sort of slightly magpie element of picking up little things. There might be elements from one writer, but definitely when I read Spark, I could see what you sort of meant immediately. That they tell, as you say in your talk, they do tell the stories very differently, and they don't write in the same way, and yet they address lots of similar issues and often come to different conclusions, like that thing about Memento Mori, but that the conclusion is it is actually death, calling them up is, as you say, absolutely not an Agatha Christie thing. So yeah, I think that there is, for me, not so much about any specific person, but just generally her keeping an eye out as to everything that's going on.
It's kind of what we said in Revivalism in our last episode about how, like you say, a magpie eye for things like Dickens, Tennyson, Austen. She was obviously an immensely literate, well-read figure, and that is something else. That is another argument to take to those people that try to imply that Christie is not on some level kind of literary and clever and academic, because my God, was she well read, and the library at Greenway shows that, doesn't it?
So my next thing on my list is the trains of their lives and works. And I said to you,
don't
when I was
read me like this,
to
Mark.
it,
Don't.
I was like, I'm not sure that I've ever heard a smile before, but that is I could hear you smiling because you were so pleased, and that was great. I did like that, so that's just a little thumbs up. My next note is simply 3 words. It should be 4. Love driver's seat. Love the driver's seat. I love it. I love it. That for me is my favourite Spark.
So was that the second you read?
It might well have been the second that I read.
It's
I remember you
probably her
saying
second
it's
most
got
famous.
teeth. I remember you saying to me, yes. And I was really bowled over by sort of the audacity of it in a way. And I said to you,
it's not for the faint-hearted.
It's not for the faint-hearted. And it's also one of those things that if a man had written it, you would read it very, very differently to Muriel Spark having written it. Because there is, this ingrained misogyny in it, which is sort of the whole point of it as well. So I found that really stuck. It's a book I think about all the time. Driver's Seat.
I think you're right. There is an ingrained misogyny in it, and she's lampooning that by evoking it. It's that really, and again, that's quite an un-Christie trope, I think, is to write full-bloodedly, almost ruthlessly at something in order to go, see, I'm doing that thing that makes you uncomfortable. I don't think that's something that Christie's, I mean, she is ruthless, don't get me wrong, but she is also, I think, sort of kinder, ultimately, about well, I don't know. She can be cynical about human nature. I don't know. No one's as unkind as Spark, though.
No.
And I mean that as a great compliment.
No, there's a pessimism.
Yeah. Maybe that's it. Maybe Christie's a cynic at times, as we all are, but Spark is a pessimist.
Yeah.
Maybe that's it.
My next point is, well, about the thing about propaganda. So you said about, Christie was approached to write propaganda. So I dug the bit out from her autobiography because I thought people might like to hear it.
Yes, please, yeah.
Where Christie says, I did not think I was the kind of writer who would be any good at propaganda because I lacked single-mindedness to see only one side of the case. Nothing could be more ineffectual than a lukewarm propagandist. You want to be able to say, X is black as night and feel it. I didn't think I could ever be like that. So maybe that's that sort of balance again.
Yeah.
But interesting enough, whilst I was listening to that, I was reading NRM, which is her Tommy and Tuppence wartime thriller. And I couldn't shake off the feeling that there's something about that particular story that's so deeply entrenched in the war and brings back Tommy and Tuppence, who we had last seen just recovering from the First World War and building up their lives and, ending on the happy note of, pregnancy and everything like that and their lives seeming to kick off. And I thought that actually there's a really strong case for saying that whether wittingly or not, this is a propaganda piece because it's saying, hey, Tommy and Tuppence got through the last war and they're going to get through this one just like you're going to get through this one.
They're going to solve it.
They're going to solve it. Yeah, they're going to absolutely keep pushing for this. And so I actually was reading it thinking, if this had been a story that Christie had written specially for like a wartime magazine or something, serialised over 10 parts, and wasn't published as a novel at the time, I think that we would absolutely see it as separate to the rest of the canon of Agatha Christie, like it's a wartime special. It's so different in lots of ways in the way that it embraces the war in the very present tense, rather than things like her other wartime books, which have got little mentions of it, or indeed, when she's writing short stories, she quite liked that they didn't ask for the war. And so I thought that was quite a good example of that she doesn't think of herself as someone able to do propaganda, and yet I sort of think that she did. There is a real sort of get up and go about this. And the fact that it's Tommy and Tuppence, who we haven't seen since the 20s and won't see for another 25 plus years, is, I think, a really good indication that, again, wheeling them out for a special occasion, a wartime special, and then they sort of get wheeled back because the nostalgia that they evoke, thank you very much, we've had that, you can go back into your cupboard again.
Yeah, I'd be really interested to hear if any of our listeners have any thoughts on that.
Yes. And my last point
Hit me.
I've got, Maggie Smith, exclamation mark. Why is she such a good fit? And you mentioned about, obviously, camp mixed with cruelty, or cruelty mixed with camp. And I was like, is there a bit of that to the way that Maggie Smith plays stuff?
Absolutely.
Because, they're withering. I mean, I'm not a Downton Abbey viewer. I mean, I've seen a few episodes, quite enough for me. Thank you very much. But there is that thing about, it's funny when she's cruel and mean to people. About several of her personas can say mean things, but because there's this campness around it. So is that why you think maybe she's such a good fit?
I think you've answered your own question, which is absolutely, that is. It's funny, there was a lot more me being me, my first draft of that talk was probably about 2 hours long or something ridiculous, and it had to be 20 minutes. And there was a lot more initially about, that alchemy between the cruel and the camp, those being two sides of the same coin almost, and that being something that both Christie and Spark very much embrace and represent, actually. And I think you're bang on. I think Maggie Smith was one of those actors who really gets both. And actually, part of the reason why I cut a lot of that stuff in the end was because I didn't think I could do justice in a short time to what a complicated and fascinating topic camp is, and certainly in relation to Christie. And actually my good friend Paul Baker, who is a queer historian, has written a fantastic book, which I did consult for this podcast, actually, called Camp, and that's out now in paperback, I think. And he is actually writing, his next book is about crime fiction, and there's a bit in Camp about camp and crime specifically, and the next book is more of a sort of sweep through all of crime fiction, and there's a chapter on Christie in that. But yes, keep an eye out for that. But yeah, Camp by Paul Baker, because I couldn't do justice to Camp. People misunderstand Camp.
Oh, yes.
It's fascinating. It's a fascinating topic. But yeah,
Well,
check
I'm
that out.
ordering the book as we speak.
Do.
Yes.
And yeah, he also wrote Fabulosa, which is about Polari, which I
yes,
love.
yes.
And he wrote a book about Section 28 as well, called Outrageous, which is, the story of Section 28, which is also brilliant. And he's a listener, so hi, Paul.
Hi, Paul.
The main thing I wanted to get at in that talk, and I thought we could discuss it now because it's relevant to us from our swinging perspective, is Cat Among the Pigeons and the Prime of Misty and Brodie, how I'm certain that there's a relationship there and the dates match, and there's plenty of evidence to suggest, which I outlined in the talk. Obviously, Cat Among the Pigeons is our first novel, 1959. I mean, published in November 1959, published in the US in 1960. Most readers would have read it, apart from the very keen beans that read it in November or December in 59. Most readers read it into the 60s. And then, of course, Prime of Misty and Brodie comes along in 1961. So I reread Cat Among the Pigeons for this episode because I think I focused on it so much when I wrote that talk. I hadn't really revisited it much since. I was using the same notes, and it's really interesting. You know, obviously, time passes, you read something again, you notice new things.
Tell me what you noticed, Graham.
Well, I'll tell you the first thing I noticed because it's on page 1, which is that we basically open with Miss Vansittart and Miss Chadwick out the front of the school greeting the pupils on the first day of term. But we're told specifically that it was the custom of Miss Bulstrode, who's the headmistress, great character, and I'm quoting now, to retire to a kind of holy of holies to which only a selected and privileged few were taken. And I was like, oh my God, that's the Brodie set. That's what she's taking away the best. That's exactly what Miss Brodie does. And even Holy of Holies, that feels very Catholic to me.
Yes.
Which of course Poirot, but also Muriel Spark. It's also, I noticed, so Detective Inspector Kelsey, who's the main detective figure apart from Poirot, he makes a comment, even games mistresses may have their love lives. And in other words, she was murdered for matters of the heart. And it's funny how, I mean, aside from that being, you know, quite revealing and problematic, there is this swirling perceived threat in both books of almost a fear of butchness or a fear of spinsterhood, which is exactly the same as what's going on with Brodie there. You know, she's so concerned about retaining her prime, and really the tension that hangs over that book is not who's going to betray her. On a very real level, the tension is she going to end up alone? And I guess the question we're invited to ask is, does that matter? Should that matter? It's interesting that I'm fairly sure one of the working titles was Death of a Games Mistress, or is that, or does Ariadne write a book called Death of a Games Mistress?
Oh, maybe. Yes, it rings a bell, and I can't remember off the top of my head.
There's something like that there, but it suggests that there was originally or at one point there was more emphasis on that as the central idea in Christie's head. Speaking of the staff, I thought it was interesting and kind of funny in a dark way that at one point Miss Bulstrode says, I am responsible for the care and safety of my pupils and, in a lesser degree, for that of my staff. And I thought, firstly, if you were writing the sort of admirable headmistress character these days, or headmaster or character these days, you wouldn't say in a lesser degree staff.
You'd include everyone together.
Yeah, but also it's ironic, isn't it? Because all the killer characters and all the victim characters do turn out to be staff.
Yes, yeah.
So it's like, actually, I think there is an irony there that maybe she should have been paying a bit more attention to who she's employing rather than the pupils, because in many ways the pupils represent a lot of the red herrings, you know, like Princess Shaista and Julia. Also, much of Cat Among the Pigeons is concerned with Miss Bulstrode's impending retirement,
yes.
right? And so I picked out this quote. Because Miss Bulstrode has made up her mind, a successor there must be, firstly associated with herself in joint rule, and then to rule alone. To know when to go, that was one of the great necessities of life. To go before one's powers began to fail, one's sure grip to loosen, before one felt the faint staleness, the unwillingness to envisage continuing effort. And it occurred to me that another cross-pollination between these books, or point of divergence actually, is that whilst Miss Bulstrode is deciding to retire throughout the book, Miss Brodie is about to be pushed. She's about to be ousted. And in both cases, that threat is what is driving each respective book.
And also, isn't that quote also indicating that Miss Bulstrode wants to really feel she's still in her prime? You know, that she doesn't want this decline of powers, that she wants to feel that she's still got that strength. And it is a tough thing to know when to let something go like that.
Yeah, so, no, absolutely. That's a good point. Yeah, carrying on with Miss Bulstrode. So Miss Bulstrode says to Inspector Kelsey, "But you must remember this. One or other of the girls may wish to make herself important by exaggerating some incident or even by inventing one. Girls do very odd things, but I expect you are used to dealing with that form of exhibitionism." And again, I thought that was ironic, and just another example of Christie operating on multiple levels in a really clever literary way, because the girls actually are key to the solving of the mystery. What they know and who they are is very key, and they have a lot of agency, and that's something that shouldn't be forgotten about either of these books, Cat Among or Prime of Miss Brodie, is that the girls in the hands of a lesser writer would not have the same level of power and agency that they are given in the text. The other thing that occurred to me was, you know, we've talked before, a lot of Christie commentators talk about how Christie is often concerned with the clearing of the innocent.
Yes.
I guess most obviously in Ordeal by Innocence in the late 50s. And in this book, there's lots of talk of clearing the school's reputation.
Yes.
And it's like, it's fair to say, I think I'm right in saying that usually when Christie spills a lot of ink about clearing the innocent, it's about a party or a family. But this is more about the idea the school will go under, the school is in the papers, the school is at threat if we don't work out who the bad apple was in the barrel kind of thing.
Yeah.
And the final point I wanted to make is actually not my point at all. It's from listener Marcus. Hello, Marcus.
Hello, Mark.
But he pointed out he was reading an obituary recently, last October, I think, of, apologies for my pronunciation, Princess Fazile, Fazile. Do write in if I'm mispronouncing that, and apologies if so, who she died last September. And her story has some remarkable similarities with Princess Shyster in Cat Among the Pigeons. So I'd recommend giving her a Google if you're interested in finding out more. But a very good point from Marcus, I thought. Hopefully that's encouraged some Agatha fans that haven't already discovered Muriel Spark to check her out. I honestly think that any Agatha fan will find a lot to enjoy therein. And a nice thing to do as well, because in the same way that September to me is very much Christie month, February is Spark month. February is the month that Spark was born. So yeah, thank you for listening.
Thank you. So please do get in touch if you've got any suggestions or comments or feedback. You can find us at Blue Sky. We're at christietime.bsky.social. We're also on Instagram and X, although we're increasingly moving away from X. But you can find us there for some time being at Christie_time, but we're staying on Instagram. Email us at theswingingchristies@gmail.com or find our website at christietime.com. That is a constant. You can always find us there. Over on X for the time being, you can find Gray at classic_Graham and me at Dr. Mark Aldridge. I'm also on Instagram with that same handle. And don't forget, if you so wish, you could buy my books, Agatha Christie's Marple and Agatha Christie's Poirot.
Yes, there's obviously a great chapter on Cat Among the Pigeons in Poirot.
There is.
And yes, please also do consider taking the time to rate or review us on whichever platform you procure your podcasts. It really does help like-minded readers and listeners find our podcast, and we're completely independent, so we do rely on word of mouth. So thank you in advance. All right, keep swinging. Thanks.
Keep swinging.
Keep swinging. Oh, you bright spark, you. Thanks for listening. The Swinging Christies is a Christie Time project by Dr. Mark Aldridge and Gray Robert Brown. This episode was recorded on the 24th of November 2024. Our artwork was designed by Bartlett Studio, and our music is by Dar Golan.
Agatha Christie Lego. I'd love to do. Obviously, I like doing Lego.
I feel like that would have good traction because it is the sort of thing that people like us would like both. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I know. But I know I don't know if I said it on the podcast before, but that there's no Agatha Christie Cluedo blows my mind. There was a special one that, like, I think they had it specially made for when Greenway was bought up by the National Trust, I think. And they did make a really
edition,
limited one, but I don't think anyone could buy it. I think it was only for like people at the National Trust and stuff. But I have seen it. I saw it at Agatha Christie Limited's offices, I think. Yeah. Oh, yeah. We're open to free. No one sent us any freebies ever.
No, they haven't.
No. like
we've got good circulation. What are people
I
thinking?
know. So
I just mean my blood. I don't mean people listening.
So if you've got any vegan treats that you'd like to send us, we will happily munch or drink them as we go through.
We've plugged my sister's wreath business.
Oh, we have. Yes,
that's
on social media.
That's just because I love my sister dearly. Hi, Hannah, if you're listening.
Where can people find that on social media, Greg?
That they can find Hannah at Ray Crescent Wreaths on Instagram, and that will take you to her brand new website, which is very exciting.
There you go.
But yeah, bless her. She's so. I said this, I think, on Blue Sky. My sister's the best. She's always been like a little bit. Shy's not quite the right word. She's just not quite. I will put myself out there, and she's just not like that in the same way. And she's so smart and she's so creative, and what she's doing with this thing is so beautiful. Like, I've got one already and they're gorgeous, and I'm like, it would be nice if we all, myself included, let her have the spotlight for once.
Well, I fancy a wreath right now. Maybe I'll go and make an order.
It was a good sell. I've got to ask you why. What I assume you love Cluedo.
Yes,
I love Cluedo. Yeah. Who do you?
I always play Mrs. White.
Of course you do. Why did I even ask? Of course you're Mrs. White.
Who do you pick?
Who do you think?
Mrs. Peacock.
Mrs.
I was a Miss Scarlet.
Miss
That's who I meant.
Scarlet.
That's how I had in my head, and I said Peacock, but I was thinking Scarlet.
Because she's a vixen.
Yeah.
That's right in, please, with your your analogues. This is quite a fun game, actually. Who's Benedict?
Oh, Mrs. Peacock, I would say.
Do you think?
Not Colonel Mustard, maybe?
Maybe Colonel Mustard. Isn't is there a Reverend?
Reverend Green.
Because Benedict's dad is a Reverend, I think.
Well, Jamie Burntal said in his talk that he had an interest in
He's
maybe
Reverend Green.
Yeah, so he's Reverend Green. Colonel Mustard is David Braun. Who's the HarperCollins publisher?
Who's your publisher? Well, as we saw at the event recently, though, David can hold a crowd.
We didn't mention that in our Christmas episode, did we?
we?
Yeah, we went to Christie for Christmas at HarperCollins. That was lovely.
Yeah, and a couple of people said it's on the 17th floor or something, and the views are amazing, and I couldn't see shit. I mean,
it was
black.
night.
Exactly.
Lots of lights.
What do they mean?